Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 127, Henry VI, Part 2, The Fox Barks Not When He Would Steal the Lamb. Last time, I started to look at Shakespeare's plays with Henry VI, Part 1, the play of almost certainly multiple authorship, and very likely one that was much revised before it was published in the first folio as a Shakespeare play. I described the likely involvement of Thomas Nashe, and you will have also heard in the last guest episode with Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones about how influential Thomas Kyd was on early Shakespeare, and another potential collaborator on Henry VI, Part 1. If you happen to skip that episode, I really would recommend that you do listen to it. Darren spoke eloquently about several of the dramatists of the early modern period and how they might have influenced Shakespeare. It is very interesting stuff. But as several of you have pointed out, in my episode on Henry VI Part 1, I rather underplayed the potential involvement of Christopher Marlowe, which I think is fair comment. The research that resulted in the New Oxford Shakespeare edition co-crediting Marlowe with all three parts of Henry VI put up very good textual arguments for his contributions, going as far as to suggest that the play could have been co-commissioned, with Shakespeare and Marlowe being allocated different parts of the play to write. It's a method of working that we see reflected in Henslow's diary, although we're never given the specifics of exactly who wrote which part of a play, so this does seem a very reasonable argument. In Part 1, Marlowe is most obviously seen in the passages concerning Joan Le Pucelle, and we'll come across him again shortly in Part 2 in the presence of the rebel Jack Cade. In an article about the New Oxford publication, Gary Taylor, one of the four academics who wrestled with the authorship attribution question for the project, explained the basis of how the textual analysis worked. To positively identify Shakespeare's hand, the frequency of specific words were compared to usage within the Shakespeare canon and across other plays of the period. So, for example, it is possible to say that Shakespeare used the word tonight more often than any other playwright. Then they also looked for words and combinations of words that were unlikely to be used by Shakespeare. With Marlowe, for example, the combination of the words glory droopeth appear to be unique to him in the period. Even before the New Oxford work, scholars had detected Marlowe's hand in the play. The passage in Act 5 where Joan pleads for help from demonic spirits and then is captured by the English is the standout Marlovian passage, where we can make several direct comparisons with the language in both parts of Tamburlaine, and her appeal to devils can be seen as a precursor to the demonic elements of Dr. Faustus. Whether we agree or disagree with the attributions given by scholars will depend on how much we can trust in textual analysis that tries to unpick originality from influence or pastiche or plagiarism. This is something that is highly complex at 400 years' distance, when attitudes to the importance of originality and the position of the author in the creative process have changed to an almost immeasurable degree. And even when we try to take that into account, we still have issues with the unreliability of the reproduced play texts. I'll leave you to ponder that and come to your own conclusions, but there is no doubt with the Henry VI plays we are dealing with collaborations to one degree or another. But now, let's get on with the second part of Henry VI. Although the dating of Part 2 is not quite as tortuous as for Part 1, there are still some uncertainties about the date. The play was registered with the Stationer's Office in 1594, but as plays were never printed concurrently with their first performance, and the Robert Greene reference to the Tiger's Heart line in Part 3 was published in 1592, 1591 is the usually accepted date for both Part 2 and Part 3, which were clearly written as a pair. The sources for the play are, as I mentioned from Part 1, Holingshed's Chronicles and Holingshed's source, Edward Hall's The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York, published in 1548. But also Richard Grafton's A Chronicle at Large, published in 1569. This was an attempt by Grafton to chronicle the entire history of the world, which, as he approached the 16th century, then narrowed to a history of England. In this part of the play, it's easier to see where Shakespeare had gone to Hall rather than to Holinshed. The differences between Henry and Margaret, one a saint-like figure rocked by events and the other a cunning manipulator, are from Hall's version of the story, as is York's description of the lineage that supports his claim to the throne. Holinshed's includes an additional generation that is not mentioned in York's speech in the play. But only Holinshed includes details of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 that Shakespeare transposes into Jack Cade's revolt in Act 4 of the play, and more of that later. And the same applies to Grafton's Chronicle, where unique elements, like the false prophecy, are included by Shakespeare, in this case in Act 2. Once again, I'll give just a very brief synopsis of the play in case you're not familiar with the historical detail as represented on stage. The play opens with events that appear to follow on from the first part of Henry VI. Margaret arrives in England with Somerset for her marriage to the king. Part of the deal Somerset brokered for the marriage is the return of 2 portions of the lands held by the English in France to the French king. Gloucester, uncle to the king and Lord Protector, is unhappy with the deal, as are most of the English lords. They discuss the merits of each of them becoming Lord Protector and begin to plot against Gloucester, while York considers his plans to take the crown. Gloucester's wife Eleanor consults a witch to try to discover the future. Margaret expresses her concerns about the way the English court behaves towards her, Henry's religion, and her treatment by Eleanor. The king cannot decide who to send to France as his regent, but eventually selects Somerset rather than York, apparently on little more than a whim. Eleanor consults a prophetic witch, but is interrupted by York and Buckingham, who arrest her for treason. The witch has been in York's pay all along. While out hunting with the Queen and various lords, the king is approached by a man who claims to have been cured of blindness at a local shrine. The king is inclined to believe in the miracle, but Gloucester soon proves the man a fake and chases him off. They hear of Eleanor's arrest, and Gloucester asks not for mercy for her, but only fair justice. York explains his claim to the throne to Salisbury and Warwick, and they swear allegiance to him and his cause. Eleanor is found guilty of treason and banished, forcing Gloucester to resign as Lord Protector. The plotting against Gloucester continues as Margaret tries to undermine Henry's faith in him. Suffolk and York join in, but the king remains convinced of his uncle's honesty. When Gloucester is arrested, the frustrated king leaves and allows the nobles and Margaret to decide on Gloucester's fate. York is commanded to lead a force to Ireland to quash a rebellion, but suspects that this is just a means of weakening his power in England. He decides to construct a rebellion in England and selects Jack Cade to lead it. The king calls for Gloucester to be tried, but learns that he is already dead. It is soon revealed that Suffolk's men were the murderers, and despite Margaret's attempts to defend him, the king banishes Suffolk. Beaufort dies in torment for his part in Gloucester's death. As Suffolk travels through Kent, he's captured by pirates and killed. Margaret mourns his death while the rebellion led by Jack Cade builds and moves towards London. His army of working men first take London Bridge and then the city, and they only disband when Buckingham reminds them that Henry V, the king's father, was their former hero. Jack Cade realises how fickle his men are and flees. He is caught while hiding in an orchard and killed. The king handsomely rewards the man who arrives at court with Cade's head. York returns from Ireland with an army ready to protest to the king at Somerset's continued freedom. As he meets the king, Somerset and Margaret confront him, and he makes his claim for the throne, backed by his 3 sons and Warwick. The lords choose sides, and each prepares for battle. The Battle of St Albans results in Henry's men becoming overwhelmed. The play ends with Henry and Margaret fleeing to London, as Warwick proclaims Richard king. And that is just a brief summary of what is a complex plot with many interacting characters. In fact, there are more characters in this play than any other Shakespeare. But it is a plot which, more or less, follows the facts of this part of English history. It is a historical period where the nobility were fighting for power amongst themselves and dragged the common men in their private armies into the fight. But this is not characterised as a civil war that devastated the country in the same way that the fight to depose Charles I would be in the future. However, in the play, the threat of civil war does hang over the actions of the main protagonists. The play is a dour recollection of the period. There is no hero here, no Henry V, no Talbot, just what seems to be inevitable decline for a country, a decline that is methodically mapped out. The king's marriage to Margaret makes for a sour opening, as the lords realise the extent of what Suffolk has given away, and what the king has acquiesced to with, it seems, hardly a thought. Through the plotting against Gloucester and the Cade rebellion, the terrible effects of the power plays of the nobility begin to ripple through the country. The different character and ambitions of the protagonists are the driving force in the narrative, but the risk to the country is made clear. The king is a weak figure, unable to take big decisions and far too willing to believe the best in all of his court. The queen is his opposite, willing to fight for her position and to become king in all but name. York and his sons are the epitome of personal ambition, but nevertheless do have a legitimate claim to the throne. Warwick is the mercurial kingmaker, but also, as we find out in Part 3, personally ambitious too. And we can't forget the character of Jack Cade, who dominates the fourth act. The working man leading a band of working men, but still a puppet of the nobility. That weakness of the king is a central point of the play. Indeed, for many critics, it is this central character trait that weakens the play. Audiences, they argue, cannot empathise with Henry, who is obviously incapable of dealing with his nobles, his wife, and his people. In effect, he makes their job of destroying the country too easy, and the pitiful tragedy of his decline becomes diminished because we do not see real decline. But then, we have to remember that this is a history play, not a tragedy. It is because of his weakness that Gloucester, his Uncle Humphrey, who was his most trusted aide, can be brought down. At the moment of Gloucester's arrest, Henry makes an astute assessment of what will follow when he says, "I, Margaret, my heart is drowned with grief, whose flood begins to flow within mine eyes, my body round engrit with misery. For what's more miserable than discontent? Ah, Uncle Humphrey, in thy face I see the map of honour, truth, and loyalty. And yet, good Humphrey, is the hour to come that ere I proved thee false or feared thy faith? What lowering star now envies thy estate, that these great lords and Margaret our queen do seek subversion of thy harmless life? Thou never didst them wrong, nor no man wrong. And as the butcher takes away the calf, and binds the wretch and beats it when it strains, bearing it to the bloody slaughter-house, even so remorseless have they borne him hence. And as the dam runs lowing up and down, looking the way her harmless young one went, and can do naught but wail her darling's loss, even so myself bewails good Gloucester's cause, with sad unhelpful tears and with dimmed eyes look after him and cannot do him good. So mighty are his vowed enemies, his fortunes I will weep, and twixt each groan say, Who's a traitor, Gloucester? He is none. But for all the fine words, he is too weak to oppose his arrest, and recognises this fact, compounding the situation. And it is because of Gloucester's death that not only does Suffolk end up banished and then dead, but also the Bishop of Winchester ends his days raving on his deathbed with guilt over his involvement with the plot. The ranks of Henry's senior councillors are being cleared out. The political vacuum left by their absence allows York to persuade many of the lords to follow him, and for Margaret to coalesce power around her, ostensibly filling in for the mentally absent king. Absent almost entirely, that is, from the realm of politics. All of his interests are in a spiritual life of contemplation. Margaret, however, is strikingly different from Henry. This is a play that lacks a central character, as Part 1 does, but there is an argument for Margaret filling that position. That, I think, is interesting, not only because she was played by a man in the original productions, and it's difficult to understand how audiences accepted that and what impact it might have had on their assessment of the character, but also because she drives many acts that, for most of history, would have been considered unwomanly. Early in the play, she shows her true colours when she leads the unfounded accusations against Gloucester and threatens him with the ultimate punishment. Thy sale of offices and towns in France, if they were known, as the suspect is great, would make thee quickly hop without thy head. She has a lot to prove, of course. Gloucester has already warned the lords about the effect of the marriage. O peers of England, shameful is this league, fatal this marriage, cancelling your fame, blotting your names from books of memory, raising the characters of your renown, defacing monuments of conquered France, undoing all as all had never been. So Margaret symbolises the emasculation of England, being the reason for the loss of the lands with no gain, not to mention her cuckolding of the king. Looking back to the sources of the play, we can see that the promoted view of English history was a very masculine one, with the roles of queens and consorts played down as much as possible. So this prominent role for a woman in a history play is probably a significant choice, and would have been noticed by the contemporary audience. Of course, the fact that Margaret was French was an easy win in setting her up as an antagonist, although in this part of the play that fact is not played on as much as it could have been. We get more of that in Part 3. There has been much critical comment about the use of language in the play, and how it's used to help define different characters, and Margaret is an interesting example in this respect. Generally, the courtly characters speak in blank verse using metaphor and allusion to decorate their speech, whereas the commoners use prose and speak plainly. In Jack Cade's case, there is a shift as he gains power towards a more courtly way of speaking. Most notably, he begins to refer to himself in the third person. The king speaks with more biblical allusions than any other character, stressing his lack of worldliness and his spiritual ambitions. Views on how Margaret used language are rather more divided. As the body of Gloucester is discovered, Margaret has a 50-line speech that uses numerous metaphors and classical allusions as she tries to make her point to Henry. Some critics hold that the elaborations in the speech are a distraction and a weakness in the writing, but others think that it is perfectly in line with Margaret's character and ambition. With the speech, they argue she is attempting to speak to Henry at his level, engage with him in high-minded thoughts, and therefore to distract him from accusing Suffolk of the murder. Others have suggested that the elaborate language is a way of showing that Margaret has lost control of her emotions and can no longer express her meaning with clarity, as if she were hiding behind the language. The completely opposing view to this is that the speech is a way for her to express her strong emotions, and shows that she is in command of her supporters and can control her rage and aim it at Henry to persuade him to her way of thinking. Whatever the case, Margaret is firmly centre stage and holds our attention for the duration. The contrast between Henry and Margaret is intentional and explicit. Henry hopes that sympathy of love will unite our hearts, but he does not stand a chance. At almost every turn, Margaret is opposed to him, or at the very least dismissive of his point of view. Just one example of many is where the swordmaster Horner and apprentice Thump stand a drunken contest, which is in itself a parody of the chivalric competitions of the past, showing just how low the country has sunk. The king sees it as a God-blessed action that will prove a point of honour, whereas the queen just settles in to watch the fight with a sneer. And this enjoyment of violence isn't just from Margaret. Eleanor, Gloucester's wife, is similarly aggressive in her tone, with threats against the men who would see her brought down. The view of women in this play is pretty dark. Henry's weakness does not only leave the door open for his nobles to plot. The Jack Cade rebellion, although orchestrated by York, takes on a life of its own when supported by the common men of Kent. Cade is a portrait of a charismatic leader whose abilities can lead the rabble not just to the gates of London, but into the city. Let's remember, the play was performed for a London audience, so this had strong resonance in the capital. Cade's rebellion is one of the high points of violence in the play, which Cade himself revels in. Speaking to one of his men, Dick, a butcher by trade, he says, "They fell before thee like sheep and oxen, and thou behavest thyself as if thou hadst been in thine own slaughter-house. Therefore, thus will I reward thee. That Lent shall be as long again as it is, and thou shalt have a licence to kill for 100 lacking 1. It is partly the level of violence described here that supports the idea that this is a sequence written by Marlowe. But going against that idea is one particular exchange that is considered by some to be very Shakespearean. When Dick enthusiastically suggests that, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers," Cade replies, "Is this not a lamentable thing, that of the skin of an innocent lamb should be made a parchment? That parchment, being scribbled o'er, should then undo a man? Some say the bee stings, but I say 'tis the bee's wax. For I did but seal once to a thing, and I was never mine own man since." It is a few lines that some take to be Shakespeare venting against lawyers who had bested him in some case he fought, but of course this is very speculative. The anarchy of Cade's rebellion is not the only alternative method of government that is presented in the play. Rather more subtly, Gloucester offers a vision of justice-based equality. Despite the personal pressures caused by his wife's behaviour, he favours trusting the judicial system, and, refusing to plead directly to the king, he accepts her punishment as just. He is noted as being popular amongst the common people, but justice is even-handed for him, and when faced with the common people attempting to petition the king through deceit, it is he who proves their falsehoods and chases them off to punishment. Even when he faces his own downfall through trumped-up accusations, he retains his faith in the justice system to prove his innocence, as he says, "I must offend before I am attained." Attainment was the law by which a convicted man could have his goods and land seized by the crown, thereby impoverishing his family, effectively ending his line. Seized lands were retained for the profit of the treasury until handed out to the next noble who was currently in the king's favour. Unfortunately for Gloucester, Suffolk takes matters into his own hands, and he never gets his day in court. The BBC 1981 production of the play, as part of the wider Complete Shakespeare series and with the 3 parts of Henry VI and Richard III deliberately linked with a common cast, set and style, drew further parallels by casting the same actor to play Gloucester and Dick the Butcher, respectively the closest advisors to Henry and to Jack Cade. The actor playing Cade had also appeared as Talbot in the first part of the production. Acts of treason loom large in the play, as both sides use the same tactics to clear their path to the king. Eleanor is undoubtedly complicit in her own downfall. Necromancy is considered an act of treason. But it is also made clear that Suffolk had set her up and entrapped her as a means of undermining Gloucester. A pretty plot, well chosen to build upon, as Richard observes, and it is he who goes on to successfully manipulate events to his own ends. The question of how much the feelings of the audience would have resonated with this picture of a violent and declining medieval world is one that we can only speculate on, and it would depend on the degree to which the collective memory was aware of this history. The fact that a play like Henry VI was successful to the point of being printed suggests that it was very popular, and presumably it was the intricate story of powerful men brought down, as well as the violence and the death portrayed on stage that made it so. Thomas Nash suggested that history plays in general displayed the valiant acts of forefathers and reproof for these degenerate days of ours, suggesting that, for the university-educated at least, parallels with their modern world were drawn, and perhaps the roots of the current ills of society could be displayed and considered. I'm not sure if the question of how historically accurate the play is a particularly relevant one, but at the very least, the changes Shakespeare made to his sources might tell us something about his purposes for the play. As I mentioned, the details used for the Cade revolt actually came from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a revolt led by Wat Tyler that resulted in a teenage Richard II first having to hide in the Tower of London in fear of his life, and then facing down the rebels just outside London. He diffused the situation by granting concessions, but not before several members of his government had been killed and London's citizens terrorised. The revolt had grown out of social changes caused by the Black Death and attempts to collect a poll tax without sympathy for the situation of the common people. Cade's rebellion in 1450 was a smaller affair that focused on the losses England took during the 100 Years' War and the perceived abuse of power by the king and some of his lords. By taking the framework of the earlier revolt, Shakespeare intones a vision of the utopia of a classless society, but he also inserted more current and specific grievances into it, voiced by Cade and his followers, making it a revolt more about the enclosures of land, a very hot topic at the time, and the causes and conditions of poverty and unfairness in the justice system. It's a fine demonstration of, as a dramatist, he had enough knowledge of his sources, if not other versions of actual events and current concerns, to manipulate them into his plays for dramatic and thematic purposes. Elements of Cade's character and his pronouncements are ridiculous, and no doubt got a laugh or a jeer from the audience, but there was perhaps a mechanism to deflect any criticism that might have been levelled at the revolution portrayed in the play by the censor. We have no information about the historical Cade apart from his name and actions during the revolt, giving Shakespeare a blank canvas. But with King Henry, his character and defects were well reported. However, in the play, these are, if anything, underplayed. The historical Henry had several mental breakdowns during his reign, and Shakespeare's sources portray him as a very weak king. As I read it, the Henry of the play is not so much mentally weak as immersed in a desire for a spiritual life, which he pursues at the expense of his political and worldly duties. This portrayal is a choice of Shakespeare's, perhaps resisting the easier path of the trope of madness, which was often portrayed on stage, to, I'm sure, the ghoulish fascination of the audience, for a more complex question of how a king would behave and find the necessary balance between the spiritual and the worldly. And, speaking of historical characters, we must not forget the arrival of Richard, youngest son of the Duke of York, onto the stage. He only has a small role in this part of the play, but he is there, worming thoughts into the ear of his father. We see more of him in Part 3 and then, of course, in his own play, but I can't help but feel that Shakespeare saw this man, this character, he could create as an absolute villain, and restrained himself, bringing him into the action slowly. He, I think, knew that audiences would love to hate Richard, and he took his time in creating him. We will, of course, hear much more of Richard. Similarly to Part 1, after its initial performance, Henry VI Part 2 was rarely performed. In fact, the first recorded performance after Shakespeare was on the 23rd of April 1864, a one-off production to mark the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. There were occasional one-off performances through the rest of the century, until in 1906 it was included as part of performances of the Henry IV, Henry VI and Richard III plays, directed by R.F. Benson, who, in his career, produced all but two of the Shakespeare canon, and had a close association with the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon. The Birmingham Rep Company had a successful production in 1951, but the complete play then remained unperformed professionally until a new RSC production in 1977. That production was particularly noted for Alan Howard's Henry, which played into the historical facts about his mental instability. The production also emphasised the Wars of the Roses as essentially a squabble between noble families, rather than a significant civil war. More recently, the play has featured as part of a presentation of the trilogy, sometimes in a condensed form and often with attempts to give it current political resonance. I wonder if Shakespeare was commissioned to write 2 history plays about Henry VI, or if the original intention was for one play to cover the entire period. If that was the case, then I guess Shakespeare soon realised that it was impossible to condense this rich historical material into one play. As they stand, these plays are long by modern standards at least, running to some 3.5 hours each if performed complete, and Richard III is equally lengthy. The effect of the decision, if that's what it was, to split the story into 2 plays is that the audience is left on a cliffhanger of an ending, but one that is perhaps a little bit arbitrary. I wonder how satisfying the first audiences found that as they filed out of the theatre. I suspect their thoughts were reflecting on the ancient topsy-turvy world that they had just been presented with, perhaps grateful that their times, turbulent as they were not that complicated. Nobles, common men and women plot against their king, fabricating the most outrageous claims against each other to further their aims. Although many will simply have enjoyed the intrigue and the violence, others may have been left wondering about how unorthodox and bleak this assessment of society really was. An ineffectual king whose prayers go unanswered, unthinkable, surely. For people who were used to seeing good rewarded, evil punished, and God's will prevailing, this was a dark, dark finish to an afternoon's entertainment. From his very earliest days, Shakespeare was, perhaps, showing his ability to subvert expectations and boldly strike his own path. It is a play that ends with the country on the brink of something close to civil war. Yes, a real cliffhanger, but a cliff whose only outlook is a bleak one. Next time, we continue with the 3rd part of Henry VI as the Wars of the Roses relentlessly progress to their bloody end. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X, just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. New episodes there are continuing the story of criticism of Shakespeare through the centuries, but you also get immediate access to all of the back episodes too. If you can spare a few moments, I'd be very grateful if you could review the podcast on your app of choice. That would really help other people to find the podcast. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.